Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Collum, and welcome to this next edition of the Human Landing Site Study Hangouts, a joint presentation by NASA's Human Exploration Operations Mission Directorate and the Science Mission Directorate here at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Today's Exploration Zone briefing on Columbus Crater, Gusev Crater, and Marth/Oyama builds on the conversations that started at the 2015 Human Landing Site workshop for human missions to the surface of Mars in Houston, Texas. Before I introduce today's presenters, let's get to know our HLS2 Steering Committee co-chairs, Paul Niles and Rick Davis. Paul is a planetary scientist in NASA's Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate at the Johnson Space Center. Paul will be sitting in for our regular Steering Committee co-chair, Jake Bleacher. Hi, Paul. And Rick is the Assistant Director for Science and Exploration in NASA's Science Mission Directorate. Hi, Rick. Paul, Rick, any words to start us off?
Paul, how about you?
Yeah, I'm really excited. One of the most exciting things for me is to think about really looking at the places we might go with humans on Mars. And we're getting to the point where we're beginning to see some of the interesting details and the interesting pictures and photographs and data from these landing sites. And it can really start to make things, you really think about what are the activities that we will be doing when we get to Mars. So this kind of discussion is extraordinarily exciting.
And I, first of all, just want to thank Dan Garcia and Arizona State University for hosting this Zoom event, because it's really key, and hopefully it allows us to have a better dialogue as a community. And then secondly, at the first Human Landing Site Study workshop, we made it possible for people to request data, whether it be images or whatever, from Mars. And what you're seeing in these briefings is essentially some of the things that were learned from those data requests. And it's very exciting to actually see this tied actually all the way to Mars, now bringing it back here in terms of teaching us not only about these specific sites, but hopefully we are starting to see lessons learned that might apply to other proposed sites / exploration zones. So it's very exciting, and a big thanks to everyone who's talking today.
Okay. Thank you both, Paul and Rick. And with that, let's get to know our presenters. So joining us from the Lunar and Planetary Institute and University's Space Research Association, we have Kennda Lynch. Kennda is a staff scientist there who will provide an overview of lessons learned from Columbus Crater Exploration Zone. Hi, Kennda. We're also joined by Alex Longo from the University of North Carolina. Alex is a student and former landing site proposer who will discuss Gusev Crater. Welcome, Alex. And to round out our cast, we have Briony Horgan from the Purdue University. Briony is an assistant professor there, and she will talk to us about the Marth-Oyama Exploration Zone. Hi, Briony. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and we'll pass them along to our presenters, or you can raise your hand using the button under the Participants tab, and we'll turn on your video so you can ask your question directly. And with that, we're going to jump right in. So we'll pull your slides up, Kennda, and then over to you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll just wait for those slides to pop up here. Really excited to be here with everybody today. To talk to you a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned from our data target requests for Columbus Crater. Just real quick before I jump into the presentation, I want to make sure to acknowledge my co-authors here, my team. Angela Deppermont, Lauren Kimbrough, and Alex Cesar are all students at Georgia Tech who've done a lot of amazing work over the last couple of years on the site, and then my co-proposer, James Ray. So we'll just jump right into the next slide. So there we go. So we'll give you an overview of Columbus Crater. Columbus Crater is what we believe is a groundwater-fed paleolake basin located in the northwestern region of Terra Serenum. It's about 110 kilometers in diameter, and it has a bunch of diverse Noachian and Hesperian age deposits. So some old and not quite as old terrain and age deposits throughout it. But what's unique about Columbus Crater is that it has this high diversity of aqueous mineral deposits that we really find compelling, because we think that this used to be filled up to the brim, up to about like almost 1,000-meter depth full of water. And we estimate there's about 1.5 kilometers depth of sedimentary and or volcanic infill. And because of the aqueous minerals and the sedimentary fill, we believe that Columbus has a high habitability and biosignature preservation potential. And if you go to the next slide, which shows you the discoveries, my my co-proposer, James Ray, had done a lot of work looking at the potential different mineral, aqueous mineral detections. And Columbus Crater is really amazing because not only does it have that varied, it has these mineral detections all throughout the basement, it has this unique bathtub ring that literally goes all the way around the basin, and that is basically hydrated sulfate salts, mostly made of gypsum. So it just makes Columbus Crater a really compelling site for astrobiology work. So compelling such that we even have studied analog sites on Earth that are similar to Columbus Crater to kind of get a feel of what kind of environment could have been there and what kind of biosignatures could have been preserved. Next slide, please. This is my field site in the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah. This is the Pilot Valley Basin. It is very similar to Columbus Crater in that it has a groundwater managed aquifer that hosts a very, very diverse microbial ecosystem that we study. Next slide, so you can see kind of an image of what the actual physical manifestation of this microbial ecosystem looks like. Next slide. And we study the microbes there, how they live, how they interact with the minerals, to kind of get a feel for what we could look for if we ever get to Columbus Crater. So we're very, very excited about this site and are doing a lot of work in trying to understand how we could look for biosignatures of past and even maybe present life there. Next slide. So that being said, we developed our exploration zone. We have, as you can see, multiple different science resource zone, science regions of interest, especially the entire rim of the crater is a science region of interest because of that beautiful bathtub ring of gypsum. And then we have a whole bunch of other regions of interest all throughout the crater. And we have one resource region of interest right in the middle. We call that the Central Peak. And it's a great area that has a lot of detections of hydrated minerals. And we've actually also seen a lot of unconsolidated material or sand dunes that are around this Central Peak that would be easy for our astronaut crew to go and pick up for resources. So we think that this is a very compelling site in that respect. One of our primary regions of interest for science is science region of interest number 1. We call that the Northeast Shore. And it basically opens up into the bathtub ring. And so we think that's one of our primary regions where we'd want to go and explore, and send our astronauts to explore and basically try to study the science and try to understand the aqueous minerals and that beautiful bathtub ring that we know is there. But one of the biggest questions that we got when we presented this site back in 2015 was, well, that's great, but you're in a crater. So can you actually get up the crater wall and get up to that Northeast Shore and get up to that bathtub ring? Can you actually get there? And then can you actually get out of the crater? So that was kind of one of the biggest questions is, well, this is all fine and good, but if you can't get up to the actual science, or you can't get out to the crater and go someplace else, you know, you're a little sunk. So we decided to focus on that as one of our first questions. So through our targeting request, we were able to cleverly be able to get what's called a digital terrain model built of a region within the science region of interest number 1 that kind of is up along the rim, so that we could see if we could actually traverse there under the requirements for human traverses. So next slide. So if you remember, we have all of these hydrated minerals, so there's a big concentration in that corner, and so we want to be able to actually see if we can get up there. So we worked with our targeting requests, and we're able to get a digital terrain model built. And if you go to the next slide. For those of you who don't know, oh, I think we're going backwards here. Next slide. There we go. For those of you who don't know, a digital terrain model, specifically a high-rise digital terrain model from the high-rise camera, It's made from 2 images of the same area on the ground, and they're taken at different angles, and they're known as a stereo pair. So what we had is we were able to find one high-rise image that met the criteria to be a stereo pair completion, and we kind of asked the high-rise team if they could go and complete the stereo pair for us so that we could have a digital terrain model made. And they were able to do that for us. And then the wonderful team at the University of Arizona was able to process our digital terrain model for us so that we could then take a look at this region here. If you look on the left-hand side, and we could actually get not only just the nice detail that we see from the high-rise imagery, but we could actually also get topographic information and elevation information. We could get a lot more information that would let us be able to figure out how easily we could move through this terrain. So this is a very powerful technique that we were able to take advantage of with one of our data requests so that we could kind of answer this question: can we get to higher terrain and some of the more interesting regions? And the key thing that we had to figure out is, can we traverse within the human mission requirements, which in this case was that the slope had to be less than 30 degrees so that the vehicle wouldn't be sloped too far back and then topple over or have problems. So that was the one thing that we had to look at. So next slide. So this, as you can see, we were only able to get one stereo, one DTM and one stereo pair completed. So we were able to do this one tiny region up here in the northeastern shore. But if you go to the next slide, but we were able to get a lot of information on that. So we evaluated 17 different traverses with this digital terrain model. And we were able to kind of assess different ways to get up and around to different regions. And in particular, we wanted to make sure we could get to the higher regions. And that's the things that you can see in the magenta, kind of that dark magenta, and the white. Those are kind of the highest regions. And we wanted to see if we could get up there. I'm going to go through a couple of the traverses that we were able to find that could meet the criteria. And the bottom answer is yes, we can get up there, which is great. And we have a couple of different ways that we can do that. So if you go to the next slide, we'll show you. So for example, we have traverse number 6. And as you can see on the top, what you see is the top slide, the top graph shows you elevation over distance from the start to the end of the traverse. And if you look on the right side of the screen, you can see traverse 6, you can see the start and the end of it. The start is kind of in the light green area and the end goes to the dark green. And so the bottom is basically your X, Y distance, and the Y-axis is your elevation. So you can see kind of what the elevation profile looks as you traverse. And then on the bottom, you can see the same distance as you traverse on the X-axis. And then on the Y-axis, you see the degrees of the slope. And you can see that this traverse, number 6, is pretty good. We're good to go. This is a traverse that we can do. We don't go over 30 at all. So we can get to this region very easily. However, we don't get to the highest regions. We only kind of get to the base of where we really, really want to be. So we need to look at a couple other traverses that get us up to the higher region. So we go to next slide, please. So this is traverse 5B. This one, if you look, this kind of gets us almost to right up to the edge of that maroon area where you want to be. And as you can see, for the most of the traverse, we're doing fine. We're under that 30 degrees. But towards the end, we just peak just a little bit over that 30 degrees a couple of times. Now, we consider this from the scientific point of view successful, but we know we have to talk to the engineers and say, hey, if we go over 30 degrees for 10 or 20 feet, is that a problem? Or is this completely, or is that something that the instrumentation can handle, the vehicle can handle, and this would still be considered a good traverse? But we thought it was a fairly decent result, that we could get most of the way there without going over that 30 degree requirement. Can I go to the next slide? This is another really, really good traverse. This is traverse 6B, and if you see, this is pink. This one takes us all the way up to that maroon terrain where we want to get. And as you can see, we almost never go over 30 degrees. We have one little spot where we just barely touch over 30 degrees, but the rest of the time we are underneath that requirement. So this is a really good traverse, and this gets up to the region where we want to be. So this we consider a very, very good traverse. Next slide. So this is one that this is another one that is 7A, and this one gets us even to the higher regions, which is to the white areas. And again, for the most part, we're under that 30-degree requirement. However, we do have more times where we tend to go over, and we go way over, like 35 degrees. So we would consider this one not a great traverse, but one that we would still possibly look at and see if we can maybe make some adjustments around this path to see if we can drop those moments where we go over the 30 degrees. So that's kind of a summary of where we're at right now with looking at this traverse validity analysis. So basically, with this particular digital terrain model, we were able to determine 9 out of the 17 traverses analyzed met the slope criteria for the human missions. And so we, as far as we're concerned, this region of Columbus Crater is traversable and allows access to regions of astrobiological interest. And it may also possibly allow access to other points in Terra Serenum. Now from science, yes?
And before you jump into science, we do have a question from Lauren Markle in the chat. What is the resolution of the data used to calculate slope? Does it also account for boulders and other obstacles that may be in the path?
That is a good question, and I believe that right now it does not. This just gives us all that this gives us is it basically gives us the elevation and the distance. So that is a very good question. We can't account for boulders or other small things in the path, because that the digital terrain model, at least from the data that we've analyzed, we're just looking at what is the slope of the, what is the slope of the elevation for the path that we're trying to go. So that is something we would have to consider as well. But the first step is, can we even get there anyway, because the slope is too steep? But if the slope's not too steep, that would be the next step, is to look at higher resolution imaging to see if these areas, how traversable they are from that standpoint. But from this first standpoint, we can actually get up there, without the slope being an issue for the vehicle in the first place. But that's an excellent question.
Thank you very much. Good, carry on.
And just real quickly to kind of wrap this up, for science, we got a lot of CRISM analysis targets. We got our other 2 requests for CRISM analysis, plus there was a lot of previous CRISM analysis. So that's what our team is working on right now. And a lot of our results, a lot of our analysis have resulted in observations of potential chlorine oxyanion, in this case, magnesium chlorate detections in the scientific regions of interest. For example, this is kind of a sneak peek of an image that our undergrad Lauren has just finished doing. If you look at the white areas here, this is part of that bathtub ring. Those white areas are potential detections of magnesium chlorate. And so these analyses, coupled with our previous observations of sulfate-bearing minerals, suggest that physiochemical conditions could have been habitable for sulfur-driven and these chlorine or perchlorate or chlorate driven ecosystems. So this is some of the science that we're chasing down now, as well as chasing down some more information on our resource region of interest to make sure that the materials are easily accessible. So those are the next steps that we're working on right now. So next slide. So, for future data analysis, like I said, we're continuing to analyze the current available CRISM data to learn more about the mineralogy and the aqueous history and resource availability. But as you can see, we did one little DTM of a very big region where we have a lot of other science data, and we'd like to know if we can actually get there, if we can actually traverse there, if we can actually send our astronauts there. So some of our future data that we need some more high resolution images of the crater floor and of this region to determine suitable landing and habitation zone, because right now we can't tell if it's smooth enough for where we've put our landing and our habitation zone. But we also need that information for the question that Lauren asked, which is, looking at other hazards for traversability. And then we would ideally need some more stereo pairs and probably some more DTMs to make sure that we can get completely out of the crater, so that we can possibly let our astronaut crews explore other regions of Terra Serenum during their time on the surface. So with that, I'll end up. Next slide. I just want to do my quick acknowledgements. So I want to acknowledge the University of Arizona High-Rise Operations Center for doing a great job on our DTM. Jen Hanley and Briony Horgan, who you'll hear from later, have been working on us with some of the CRISM analysis. We've been collaborating on that. And then our funding sources, the NASA Astrobiology Institute, Ford Foundation Fellowship Program, and of course, Georgia Institute of Technology. And with that, I'll take any more questions.
Paul, there was a great question by George about slope, and Paul Niles has answered that through the chat. And this is partly about building up the community too. So you can either ask with the chat log, that's fine, that's how we have traditionally done it, but we also welcome using the hand function so that we can start to all get to know each other better. So thank you, Kennda. And also one thing I would say on behalf of the Mars Exploration Program, we hear you loud and clear that we need a lot more high-res imaging, and that is a really important takeaway. So thank you for emphasizing that.
Yes, just again, thank you, Kennda. And I believe our next presenter up will be Alex. So Alex,
all right,
pull your slide up and jump right in.
Sounds good. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about Gusev Crater, home of the Spirit rover. But before I get started, I would just like to say a quick thank you to Rick Davis and the Mars Recon team at NASA headquarters for taking me on as an intern last semester. I've been telling them about these results since day one, so I hope they're worth the wait. And I would also like to thank my fellow members of Team Columbia Hills for really great productive discussions which have helped me advance my interpretations of these features. There are three primary attributes. Oh, next slide, please. There are three primary attributes which combine to make Gusev Crater an enticing exploration zone for humans on Mars. The first is that we've been there before. We learned a lot from the Spirit mission, and we know that the site is safe and interesting for humans when they arrive. Second, the site has diverse surface geology, and you can't have a sustainable program without continuing rationale for exploration. And Gusev provides that in the form of multiple ROIs across the entire EZ. And finally, as I'm going to discuss in detail in this presentation, there appears to be evidence for subsurface ice deposits, which could be an exciting resource for humans when they reach Mars. The EZ's location remains unchanged from the first workshop. Several additional science and resource ROIs have been identified using HiRISE and the context imager on MRO. You see those in the colored circles in the map. And then the primary resource has changed from pingos, which are permafrost mounds, to potential subsurface ice deposits for ease of extractability.
And Alex, stand by 1 second. We had a great question from Andrew Annex. Basically, how far can traverses be and remain safe? And Andrew, thank you. I'll take that one since I was on the steering committee for it. We assume that the dimensions of the exploration zone, which is 100 kilometers in radius, 200 in diameter, the 100 kilometers was the maximum traverse that we would be doing with rovers, and that was what drove it. So so that's the current logic, and as we get smarter about how to do this, that may evolve. But that is what we have been considering to be a safe traverse.
One quick follow-up on that. That addresses distance, but does it say anything about how long the crew could be away from the habitat?
There were implicit assumptions about that, and I don't remember those, and we probably should recreate those for the future.
All right, cool. But thank you for that question, Andrew, and please continue, Alex.
All right, so if you go on to the next slide, the MRO team has done an exceptional job with data acquisition. Hats off to the folks who were working on HiRISE. We requested 3 images and we got 4. And these pictures show us that within the Gusev exploration zone, there is stratified ash, which formed only about 1 billion years ago. There's a global unit, there's a unit of olivine, which could have a global distribution. And there's the potential water ice deposits, which could be a resource for astronauts within the EZ. Next slide. The first image targeted Galdakao crater, a small impact which is located on the northeast rim of Gusev. And to kind of give a big picture view of Galdakao, the right-hand side of the crater is covered by standard flood basalt lava. It's kind of similar to what Spirit found in Gusev itself. the right side appears to be covered by some sort of dark layered material. In addition, you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, there's an image of a dendritic valley channel entering the crater. So together, the layers in the channel seem to suggest that there was once a lake. What high-rise
one quick question, another question from our audience from Lenore Miller. The question is, how are scientifically interesting areas determined? Are they primarily of interest to astrobiology, or are there multiple fields interested? So maybe Alex, you could say something about why did you pick the science regions of interest in Gusev, and then Rick, you might add something about the general standards for human landing site studies.
Well, within 100-kilometer radius exploration zone, we're talking about something the size of the state of Delaware. So that's a lot of land. And if you place the EZ properly, you can position it so that there are targets within it that are interesting to astrobiologists, to geologists, to sedimentologists, to meteorologists. When we do go to Mars and we're able to explore on an unprecedented scale with humans, I think the entire scientific community is going to benefit greatly, just like we did during Apollo.
So I would just add to that, and thank you for the question, Lenore. For the first workshop, we actually had a fairly extensive team look at the priorities with a human being on the surface of Mars and what would you maximally do to take advantage of that. And they came up with a set of priorities, of which astrobiology was a major one, obviously. We need to keep thinking about that as we get smarter. I know Paul feels strongly about that, and I would maybe see if he has anything else to add. That work was built on a previous study that was done maybe about 10 years ago before that. And it probably needs to be redone again, because as we get smarter and really understand how you can use human crews there to maximize the science we can do, that should evolve. Paul, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there was a wide variety of landing sites, potential landing sites identified in the workshop, and that was proposed from a wide variety of different kinds of scientists. So there's people interested in volcanoes, there's people interested in water, there's people interested in biology, as well as people interested in the interior of the planet. So that's there's definitely a wide variety of different scientific interests that are our stakeholders. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Lenore, for that great question. Please carry on, Alex.
All right, so we're on slide 6, right? So what high-rise resolution allows us to do is it shows us that the sediments in Galdakao are relatively smooth. The only major topographic features are yardings, which are erosionally resistant structures carved by wind. And really the biggest topographic feature is the yarding you see on the right-hand side of the slide. The high-rise also shows us that there isn't really a sharp contact between the layers on the left-hand side of the crater and the lavas on the right-hand side of the crater. It's much more of a smooth transition. Next slide. The valley entering Galdakao is mostly obscured by sand ripples. And this is an important discovery because these could potentially be hazards for astronauts driving up and down this channel. There appears to be no layering in the walls of the valley. The walls aren't very steep. It's a pretty shallow feature. And there also seems to be miniature channels entering the larger, well-defined channel, as you can see in the right-hand side of the picture. Perhaps these were carved by wind. Next slide. Now, on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a picture of Horgan crater, which is kind of your prototypical Martian paleolake. Sediments in Martian lakes are usually very fine-grained, they're light-toned, and that's not what we see in Galdakao, the center image. Instead, Galdakao seems to have a lot more in common with what's called the Medusa Fossae Formation, which is a large regional deposit of stratified ash, which formed about 1 billion years ago. And it's located in the vicinity of Gusev and Galdakao. So it's possible that some exposures of Medusa Fossae formation could have been protected inside this crater. Moving, next slide, please. So the geomorphology observations from high-rise show us that these layers inside Galdakao are actually probably stratified ash rather than lake bed sediments. In addition, the valley that enters into it shows no unambiguous evidence of activity by water. So it could have been formed by wind, potentially with minimal amounts of water involved. And at Gusev crater, because of the presence of these deposits, humans could have access to both older lavas on the floor of Gusev itself and much younger airfall deposits in Galdakao. So it provides a kind of two for the price of one science return for volcanology. Next slide, please. The second image covers Castril crater, which is located on top of a deposit of etched terrain. Etched terrain is an enigmatic type of feature that covers parts of the floors of Gusev. Many origins have been proposed for etched terrain, including volcanism, lake bed deposition, or glacial till. And our hypothesis was that since Castril penetrates the etched terrain, perhaps it could reveal their interior structure or any underlying material. Next slide, please. There are two primary types of etched terrain in Gusev crater. The left-hand image shows small, dark-toned knobs of etched terrain, which were explored by Spirit. And these are primarily olivine volcanic rocks altered to carbonate, a type of hydrated mineral. On the right-hand side, you can see that in other parts of Gusev, there are larger knobs of etched terrain, which usually are light-toned and oriented in one direction. But the similarities between these two kind of beg the question, are they related? Do they actually share the same formation history? If you go to the next slide, you can see that context images of Castril already show the larger blocks of etched terrain in the red box. However, what high-rise allows us to do is detect for the first time these smaller knobs of etched terrain that were of the same class that were explored by Spirit. And you can see some of those in the green box towards the top of the image and the edge of the deposit. If you go on to the next slide, you can see Castril itself. The floor appears to be entirely covered by sand. So it didn't really show us any information about the interior structure of the etched terrain. We can tell from this image that the crater has a moderate age, because if you look at the picture of the rim, you still can see bedrock, but it's slightly eroded. Next slide, please. Since the small and large knobs of etched terrain are co-located, they most likely share the same origin, namely olivine volcanic rocks altered to carbonate by acid rain, as was proposed by Steve Ruff and Victoria Hamilton last year. The etched terrain was previously interpreted to be a local glacial deposit, so at the first workshop, I suggested that it could be a water resource for humans. However, since olivine usually is a volcanic rock, we probably should be looking elsewhere in Gusev for water feedstocks. If you go to the next slide, we kind of got two images for the price of one.
One quick question, Alex.
Oh, yeah.
You've talked about how etched terrain is kind of a big feature here, and that we can't explain the origin. Do we see anything like that anywhere on Earth, or is this a feature that's unique to Mars, or is it unique to Gusev crater?
Well, etched terrain, the olivine altered carbonate that I mentioned on the previous slide actually has been observed as far away as Nili Fossae and Jezero crater. So it kind of has a global distribution on Mars. I'm not sure if there are any Earth analogs or not. That could be something to look into. There may be something in the deserts of Earth that resembles etched terrain, but basically it's altered volcanic rock that's been carved by wind.
But thank you very much. Please.
No problem. All right, so we are on slide 15, which is the final images that were acquired. We kind of got 2 for the price of 1 because HiRise acquired a stereo pair. And these images contained what were probably the biggest surprises of this project. They show a relatively small crater, which is young and fresh, superimposed on top of an older and degraded crater. And we originally suggested this image because we thought these craters might be windows into the interior structure of the ancient highlands which surround Gusev. Next slide. Unfortunately, none of those layers appear to be present inside the crater rims. But the younger crater does have very well-preserved exposures of bedrock around its rim. In some places like Valles Marineris, bedrock is associated with recurring slope lineae, but we didn't see any of those here, which is kind of consistent with previous observations of the Gusev region. There are no RSLs or anything of that sort. Next slide, please. Focusing in on the floor of the younger, smaller crater, you'll notice that it's very flat, and the primary topographic features are multiple large blocks which are tilted at angles. And this immediately reminded me of ice rafting in Antarctica. So that begs the question, could there potentially be near-surface ice in this part of the exploration zone? It's possible, but these features could have also formed through wind erosion or some other process, so additional evidence for ice was necessary. Pedestal craters, as you see in these images, are also indicators of subsurface ice. They form when a meteor impacts ice-rich ground, ejects a fluidized ice layer, which is altered by heat and becomes impermeable to sublimation. So it preserves ice near the surface. And these have already been observed in abundance in the Tharsis region of Mars by Schoen and Head. And they are pretty young features because after only a few million years, the wind erodes them and these well-preserved blankets of ejecta are no longer visible.
So Alex, just for pacing purposes, you got about 3 minutes left, just so you can make sure we cover everything.
All right, so next slide shows a wide diversity of pedestal craters, and most of these are actually located on the floor of the older, larger concentric crater, which implies that the ice has a larger distribution. And also, it would be more easily accessible because the slopes are much less steep. Next slide. So taken together, the tilted blocks on the floor of the younger crater, the pedestal craters, and the hydrogen maps, like you can see in the center, suggest that there could potentially be near-surface water in the Gusev region. And if this proves to be true, then astronauts could harvest it for use as rocket fuel and/or consumables. However, what we really need is an ice mapping orbiter to confirm the presence of these deposits, whether or not they really still are present and whether or not they are close to the surface. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I think these images show that Gusev remains a highly desirable candidate exploration zone for humans. They show that there are both geologic units which are relevant on a regional or global scale in the form of the Medusa Fossae Formation ash and the etched terrain, and there also could potentially be water that astronauts could harvest. Next slide, please. On a broader scale, these discoveries also show that it's possible, potentially possible, for water ice to exist near the surface around the equator of Mars, which is seen in Gusev and also has been potentially observed in Tharsis and Meridiani. This is really a game changer because previously it was only thought that ice could be found in the mid and high latitudes, where geologic diversity is generally reversed and temperatures are colder at night. So I think that given these results, it would be highly beneficial to search for similar exploration zones near the equator that could have deposits of ice for extraction by astronauts. And if you go to the next slide, I would just like to say thank you. You're a great audience, and your dedication and passion is going to be what gets us to Mars.
Alex, thank you so much. And
No problem.
we also hear you loud and clear on an ice mapper. That's and that was a finding from the first workshop that we are working extremely hard to try to figure out some way to do that. We really view that as a key part of the future exploration of Mars. And then for everybody else, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat or you raise your hand. We learn from your questions, so thank you.
All right, thank you, Rick, and thank you, Alex. And with that, we'll move on to our last presenter for the day, Briony Horgan. So Briony, take it away.
Great, all right, thanks so much. All right, so I'll be talking about our last site, which we're calling Marth Oyama Exploration Zone, because it really is covering two really different interesting terrains within this one area of Mars. This area is interesting both for really diverse astrobiology targets as well as compelling rationale for exploration and resources there. So if you can go to the next slide. Great, so here's kind of a one-slide overview of the Marth Oyama Exploration Zone. So you can see in the map in the upper right where we're located. So we're right, not too far from the equator of Mars, kind of smack in the middle of the map, right along what we call the dichotomy boundary on Mars, which is this big topographic boundary between the northern lowlands and the southern highlands. You can see reflected in that topographic map where blue is low and red is high. So Marth lies right on the edge of that area. And the reason this area has been extremely interesting to the Mars scientific community is because it contains the largest, thickest, most abundant, and most diverse deposit of hydrated minerals anywhere on Mars. We're talking about a huge deposit, hundreds of meters thick, hundreds of kilometers in extent, that really covers this entire area. And that is exciting both from a resources perspective as well as from an astrobiology perspective, because those minerals form due to long-term interactions with liquid water on ancient Mars. And in fact, this area, the reason we've been so excited about it is because these deposits date from the most habitable period in Mars's history, around 4 to 3.8 billion years ago, right when all of the river valley networks and lakes and all of that were the most active across the surface. And the minerals that we see deposited here were formed during that period due to interactions with liquid water. The sort of leading hypothesis for how these enormous deposits of hydrated minerals formed was probably due to rain falling on either volcanic tephra or ash or other sediments and altering them into deep and extensive soils, clay-rich soils, just like the clays in your backyard potentially. But we also see evidence for this continuing over the very long term. It could be up to on the order of millions of years or more. We also see evidence for lots of different other minerals other than clays that indicate diverse surface conditions, things like maybe even including wetlands at the surface. We see evidence for sulfates indicating evaporating water. We also see evidence for groundwater systems in the form of filled fractures and things like that, where water was moving around underground and leaving minerals behind. And then finally, so looking in the map on the lower right, you can kind of get a sense for the terrain here. So Marth Vallis itself is this big outflow channel you can see outlined and dashed in that topographic map, where again, blue is low, red is high. And that's a big outflow channel that was carved just after this time period. And it cuts down through this big plateau that's composed of these hydrated minerals. And just to the left of it in that plateau, you can see Oyama crater outlined here. And so Oyama crater is really interesting because it impacted into these extensive hydrated mineral deposits right around this same time period when they were forming. And we can actually see evidence that rain or snowmelt or something like that actually washed some of these hydrated minerals down into Oyama crater, probably into some kind of lake or transient lake or something like that. And so we have the combination of the outflow channel cutting through the clays, we have the clays on the plateau, and then we have Oyama crater that we think may have once hosted an ancient lake. And so we have this great combination of diverse geology from ancient Mars. So if we talk about science objectives of this site, if you can go back actually really quickly. So science objectives, we have diverse habitable environments at the surface and the subsurface. There's a lot of great opportunities to look for biosignatures in those environments. There's also diverse examples of volcanic, tectonic, and impact processes that we can try to investigate at this site, including the dichotomy boundary itself, this huge feature on Mars. We talk about exploration though, again, one of the big drivers for this site is the fact that we have these abundant, extremely accessible, just sitting at the surface, again, hundreds of kilometers, in extent of very rich water-bearing deposits right at the surface. And, basically because they're everywhere, we have a lot of flexibility in terms of where we want to land, where we want to go. Okay, so now next slide. Okay, so here's a really nice kind of 3D view of this area. And so here you can see Oyama crater, sort of, again, impacting down into these extremely extensive clay-rich deposits. And in this 3D view, the clay layered deposits are all of these kind of light-toned areas you can see popping out on the plateau. So it's all of these areas. And when I say clay-rich, we think this is we really actually mean that. On Mars, these areas exhibit the strongest and clearest phyllosilicate clay signatures anywhere on the planet, and are the most extensive we see anywhere on the planet. And in terms of how much does that mean? Well, one thing to keep in mind on Mars is just detecting the mineral itself doesn't necessarily mean there's a lot there. Just seeing it in our orbital data could just mean, a few weight % of that mineral. But in this case, the signatures are so strong, our model suggests that we're talking about at least upwards of probably 50 weight % clays. And in some cases, we could even be talking about rocks that are totally dominated by these hydrated minerals. And that's supported by the kind of terrestrial analogs we're using to understand these sites. So all these light-toned areas correspond to these clay minerals. And you can see Oyama impacts into those. On top of that, we have this dark-toned capping unit. We think that's a later volcanic deposit, maybe a tephra or a lava flow. And you can see Marth also cutting down through those clay-rich deposits with this, again, it's an ancient outflow channel, a flood channel. On the right, you can see what the stratigraphy we think is present at this site. So again, we're talking about hundreds of meters of these clay-rich deposits. And you can start to get a sense of the mineral diversity we see here. So it's not just the fact that there are clays, it's that we see all kinds of different clay minerals and other types of minerals throughout this area, telling us that there were diverse geochemical environments, diverse environments that life could have lived in all over this area. And you can kind of get a sense for just how deep and extensive these materials are. Okay, next slide. Okay, so astrobiology is one of the big drivers for this site. And in fact, because of that, this site has been a top contender in the top 2, 3, or 4 kind of landing sites going into the Mars Science Laboratory rover, Mars 2020 rover, and the ExoMars rover landing sites. ExoMars rover landing site, it actually was very nearly selected, but for engineering reasons, they decided to choose a site just a few hundred kilometers to the west over in Oxyoplanum. Is sort of getting into similar rocks, but not quite the same ones. But the argument for astrobiology here is, again, that we're talking about these ancient rocks preserved from this very habitable period of Mars's history, diverse minerals that could have actually trapped organics and other biosignatures, diverse environments that could have led to different ways of doing that, giving us lots of chances to see signs of ancient life. So you can see some examples of the kind of environments and things we're talking about here. On the left, we're seeing a nice view of an outcrop in Oyama crater. All these kind of, in high rise, these kind of nice blue and red layers correspond to what we think are river or lake deposits, basically where these clays from up on the plateau were washed down into the crater and deposited, we think perhaps in an ancient lake. And then perhaps also altered more in that lake and by more rain falling on the surface. You can see some examples of these big mineralized fractures. So all these kind of light tone polygons you can see peeking out from under this dark capping unit in this middle picture are these mineralized fractures we think formed probably in this case actually relatively near the surface due to desiccation of these clay-rich rocks. And then water flowing through them, filling in those cracks and leaving behind different kinds of minerals. Maybe we can't tell which ones, but perhaps sulfates, silica, things like that. And that's a great way to trap organics and other biosignatures. And then finally, one new result I'll mention a little bit later is we actually see a lot of evidence for sulfates in this area too, and kind of these distinct horizons that we can map out from orbit. In this case, you can see this perspective view. And here is the yellow kind of rings you can see here correspond to this horizon of sulfates as well, which is a salt formed due to evaporation. Okay, next, please. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what's going on within the landing site. So just because we have so much going on here, we couldn't really choose where the landing site should be. There's lots of options and lots of flexibility. So here we're showing sort of 2 options for the range of landing sites and associated kind of maximum extent of exploration zones we're considering for this site. So landing site number 1 versus 2, I mean, they're getting at very similar science and resource ROIs. The difference is mainly what kind of material do you want to build your base on, right, your habitat. So landing site number 1 is actually located on this big volcanic unit that could be great in terms of regolith for construction. landing site number 2 is located on these extensive clay deposits themselves. And so it really depends, do you want to land on something that's really great for construction or something that's a resource right under your feet? So if you go to next, please. Okay, so here are our ROIs. So there's a lot going on here. We have a lot to choose from. But just to kind of give you a brief list that we're talking about, first you can see the resource ROIs. Again, it's anywhere you see these kind of light toned rocks popping out in this grayscale image. Those are those clay-rich rocks. You can literally scrape the clays right off the surface, really anywhere in this area. So very, very accessible. But in terms of science, we of course want to investigate the clays themselves and the ancient environments they preserve. We want to get down into Oyama and look at the lake deposits. That's at science ROI number 2. One thing we've been doing a lot of work on with the ExoMars landing site, which is located just kind of to the south of this image, are these really interesting filled fractures that are a great target for astrobiology. We also have evidence for lava in Oyama capping off these lake deposits. The upper volcanic unit on the plains might be pyroclastics. Those are really important for trying to get samples that we can date all of these geologic events with, right? Because volcanic rocks are really fantastic for getting real quantitative dates. And finally, lots of impact craters, recent, old, that we can try to understand how that affected the habitability of Mars. And then finally, of course, the northern plains and dichotomy boundary, we can actually, there are plenty of paths down into Marth Vallis itself, where we can check out the outflow channel and then actually traverse out onto the northern plains and check out that contact between the ancient southern highlands and the younger northern plains. Okay, next, please. Okay, so in terms of data coverage, what have we learned? So, I mean, one huge advantage of this site is that it has excellent data coverage. There have been 4 different highly studied rover landing sites in this area already. You can actually kind of pick them out based on where the images are clustered in this map. Here we're showing high-rise coverage from the entire time. You can actually kind of make out the ExoMars landing ellipse is kind of that big ellipse of images just to the south of the Marth Vallis channel. There's a Mars 2020, 2 different Mars 2020 landing site ellipses within the sort of one exploration zone we've highlighted here. So really what's really nice about the site is we have a very mature exploration strategy. We know what the ground looks like. We know what the risks are. We kind of know what we're getting into. But the additional coverage we've gotten has still helped. So if you go to the next slide. So here's the new high-rise that's been acquired since the 2015 Human Landing Site Workshop. As you can see, again, the ExoMars landing site pops out. That was really just studied up until just last year. But some of these new high-rise images that are acquired within this exploration zone that's circled here have helped to fill in some gaps in extended science targets. So I'll show some examples of those. If you go to next. We also have a few new digital terrain models like Kennda talked about earlier. And that is actually helpful for trying to understand the relationship of some of these units and things in the area. But we have a pretty good understanding of the topography in this area from, again, all the extensive rover work that's been done. Okay, next, please. Okay, so what did we ask for in 2015 for this landing site? We asked for a few different things. We've gotten acquired some of that data. And I think, honestly, again, the site is so mature. I think we have more or less what we need in terms of developing a strategy. At this point, I think we're at the state where we are capable of doing a lot of the kind of detailed engineering analyses you would want to do to really develop a more detailed strategy. So that's really, that's going to head over to the engineering side of things, right? What do we need from a really detailed technical engineering point of view? So if we go to the next slide.
One quick question
Sure.
from the chat. Alexander Sessa asks, with respect to preserving biosignatures, do we have a sense of how quickly some of the layers were in place, especially the ones capping the layers that could be indicative of a marsh-like environment?
Yeah, great question. So one thing we don't know is how quickly the whole sequence of layers was in place. That's one of the questions we want to answer. But we do know from crater counting on some of those volcanic units, both in Oyama and up on the plateau, that those are in place very early. Those are about 3.8 billion years. So there was a nice protective capping unit over probably most, if not all of this area by that time. And so because of that, we think everything here has been pretty well protected. We don't see a lot of evidence for later alteration by fluids. Everything is now being kind of freshly eroded and exposed. And it's one of the reasons it's such an interesting place.
All right. Well, thank you for that question, Alexander, and thank you, Briony.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Yeah, okay, so here's just some eye candy to show you what we've gotten out of some of these new high-rise images. So here's one of my favorites. I pulled this is actually what the high-rise team put on their website from this image after they acquired it. And it was just so spectacular, I had to share it. This is right at the mouth of Marth Vallis, sort of where it's feeding into the northern plains. And here what you can see is these light-toned rocks. Those are actually probably the same clay-rich rocks we see up on the plateau. But here you can see that they're capped by all this kind of dark tone material and this is what's actually covering the northern plains in this area. This is a place where we could actually try to understand the relationship between the material that's filling in the northern plains and these ancient clay-rich rocks. And you can also see lots of weird tectonic features. It's clearly been pretty messed up. So this would be sort of a nice scientific wonderland for an astronaut to explore. So we go to next. Here's another example, some additional data we got in Oyama. So looking at some of these incredible layered deposits of, we think is a combination of both river and lake deposits, as well as sort of more additional weathering that happened in Oyama. And you can see just beautiful outcrops of layers, lots of diversity. Again, kind of the same mineral diversity we see up on the plateau, but in this sort of lake context, which is a whole different kind of environment that we'd be very excited to explore. So we go to next. Okay, and I also wanted to draw some attention to some very cool science results. Again, this is a really heavily studied area on Mars because it's just such a spectacular example of ancient Mars rocks. And so we've had some very cool new mineral detections corresponding to, again, these very extensive mineral horizons. We now know that the very top of the sequence is actually not nice crystalline clay minerals. It's actually composed of these weird, poorly crystalline things. On Earth, these tend to form in cold climates. And so we think that's actually a record of the climate cooling on Mars over time, going from nice crystalline minerals in the middle to poorly crystalline material at the top. One very exciting result is possible carbonate horizons throughout this area. And carbonates are exciting because they tell us that the weathering that occurred was kind of under neutral conditions. So it wasn't very acidic. It was probably due to interaction with a carbon dioxide atmosphere to produce carbonate. And so if we could actually sample those, that would be they might actually preserve a record of the ancient atmosphere, which is exciting. And then finally, again, these sulfates that have been sort of mapped all through the middle of the clay sequence that we think reflect a sort of probably drier evaporative periods in the history of this site. In terms of resources, all of these things are interesting. Poorly crystalline minerals are actually fantastic at releasing water at low temperatures. And so one of the concerns about using clay minerals as a possible water feedstock is that they require relatively high temperatures of heating to get the water out. But poorly crystalline minerals and sulfates actually both allow a water extraction at much lower temperatures. So that's great. Okay, go to next. And then just a few, we've had some really interesting science results come out. These mineral filled fractures, I had some undergrads working on this and mapping them. Again, great for astrobiology. There have been some possible recurring slope lineae identified in some areas around this site. So that's something we could potentially investigate. And there's also been a really nice summary paper published by Poulet et al. That's just about to come out in astrobiology this month. Great, all right, next slide. So to tie this off, so the argument for Marth and Oyama is that it's an exciting and well-developed exploration zone with really excellent resource potential. Really, if you want to think about using minerals as a water feedstock, this is one of the best places to do it on Mars. And we have diversity and abundance of different kinds of hydrated minerals. They're all over the place. You can really, it means we have a very flexible exploration strategy in this region. In terms of data, I think we're doing really well. I think if there are additional data needs here, it's really just to serve detailed engineering studies. I think the potential and overall strategy of the site is well characterized. And really what this comes down to is that the science at this site is really compelling. Again, it's been a finalist, but not yet quite selected for any rover mission because it'll help us understand what did the climate and surface environment of Mars look like 4 billion years ago and what organisms lived there. And being able to visit a site like this would allow us to address diverse science objectives, addressing these really big solar system level questions about the geological and astrobiological evolution of Mars. All right, thanks. I'll take any last questions.
All right, thank you very much, Briony. In the last 2 minutes, I was hoping kind of a question for all of you. Are there any lessons you've learned or advice you would give about, as you've studied these landing sites in more detail? Do you think other landing site proposals or proposers anywhere on Mars might be able to take advantage of or also learn from? Briony, you want to start?
Sure. So I think some of these big new science results we've had from this area have actually come from digging into the old data. And that's one thing that, having the community getting funding and all of that to dig into the old data and trying to expand the science we can do there has also helped identify new resources and things too. So my advice would be to, get on with some experts in some of these data sets and see what you can find in some of those existing data sets, because there might be some very cool things there.
Thank you very much. Alex, anything to add?
Well, I'd say that what every picture really does is tell a story, and there's no camera better than that high rise. So I think that a great next step for the analysis of not only these landing sites but others would be to take a more detailed look at them with high-rise class imaging and see what more surprises we can turn up.
Thank you. Kennda, last word to you.
I second both everything that that Briony and Alex said. I would also say don't be afraid to get creative with the data that we have. Like Briony said, digging into the old data is very helpful, but also get creative with respect to, you know, if we need more digital terrain models or we need other analysis, see what you can build off of the data that's already there instead of asking for new data. We were able to get our DTM because we found an old high-rise image that was already there, and we just had to complete the pair. And it was something they had never done before, and they were able to do it. So don't be afraid to ask for something a little kind of out of the box, and you might get some new data out of it.
Good advice all around. Thank you very much. And we do have one last-minute question from Kirill. Can I ask all three presenters to evaluate the current level of our knowledge according to their scientific intuition, to what extent each of the craters is currently studied, so that one can make a final decision about which terrain to develop first by humans? How much investigation is left to do? All right, so Kennda, you want to start us off? How much more do you need to know about Columbus Crater before you'd be ready to send humans there?
I would say that we do need to know quite a bit more about Columbus Crater. We still don't really have a good handle of the basin floor and where we could safely land and put a habitation zone. We just need some more imagery, more high resolution imagery in certain areas for that. Again, as I said in my presentation, I think we just need to make sure we can get out of the crater. So from a standpoint of traversability and kind of operation scenario, I think we have a little bit more work to do. From a scientific standpoint, I think we've got a lot of good scientific data that we just need to kind of process and get out there and kind of, bounce off other members of the community. So I think scientifically, we're pretty far along. I think we need more information from an operational standpoint.
Thank you. Kennda, you want to add anything? No, sorry. Briony, what would you say about for Oyama / Marth?
Yeah, I think Marth and Oyama, I think we're at a stage where there's still more we can do with the existing data and data that's coming down. But I think scientifically, we have a lot of great hypotheses for what's going on there. I think we have a lot of great ideas for the kind of exploration we can do. And I really think we're at the stage where a lot of the details are more technical and engineering in nature. So we're actually excited to be at that point.
Cool. Last word to you, Alex.
Well, Gusev is kind of a special case because we have the Spirit, already have the Spirit mission, which is an incredible data set we're still learning things from. But I'd say that thanks to that information, I feel comfortable going to Gusev on a lander tomorrow. I don't know what better way to put it than that. I think we are ready to send humans if and when the hardware is ready.
All right. Thank you very much to all of you. And so unfortunately, we're out of time, so that'll wrap up today's Hangout. Once again, thank you to all of our presenters, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us. If you have any future thoughts or ideas about other topics we might touch on, please email them to us. You can always find us at nasa-mars-exploration-zones@mail.nasa.gov, and send any comments, questions, or other feedback there as well. Paul, Rick, any last minute words you want to add?
Paul, how about you?
No, it's excellent presentations and a lot of really exciting science.
The only thing I would add is a big thanks to Kennda, Alex, and Briony for all of us, and to Dan and ASU for hosting this event. And then the last thing I want to thank is everybody on the telecon as well as in the HLS2 community. It's your questions and your ideas that are going to make this possible, and we really appreciate all your engagement and ideas. So thank you.
Well said. And yes, once again, thank you. We hope you can join us on February 27th for our next Hangout. It's titled Paving the Road to Mars, Civil Engineering at the Human Landing Site. And so we hope to see you then.